I think we can all agree cycling produces no carbon emissions. And it's good for you.
Great!
The more meat we eat, the more cows there are producing greenhouse gases. Definitely not a couple of bright sparks. What we leave on standby not only produces greenhouse gases, but can also keep some of us awake at night. Oh, do give a thought to where our rubbish goes.
This presentation is with reference to United Nations and Indian response on biodiversity. Knowingly or unknowingly, India has identified the biodiversity through its national animal, which is nothing but tiger, national bird peacock, national tree banyan, national flower lotus. Andhra Pradesh state also has identified black buck as its state animal, Indian roller as its state bird, neem tree as its state tree, water lily as its state flower. Identifying the significance of the biodiversity, United Nations has given a slogan to the international community: think globally, act locally, and change personally. The theme of this slogan is that the global thought should be developed across the international community. The acts should be localized. That means keeping in view the circumstances under which they are acting. That should be the expectation of every human being, and he should change personally. So by practicing this slogan by the international community, United Nations is expecting from the international community that the significance of the biodiversity is being put into lifestyle of the human being. Coming to Indian scenario, Mahatma Gandhi has identified the importance of the nature in such a way that, and he has prescribed the concern for the nature through a specification stating that nature has provided everything for the need of the man, but not for the greed of the man, wherein he is requiring the human being to have his limitations and then act or interact with the nature in such a way that he is not practicing the greed, but he is identifying his need and accordingly make use of the natural resources. Biodiversity is popularly known as natural resource. The Indian Constitution, by its Article 39B and C, takes care of the material resources which are to be distributed for the purpose of serving the common good. Material resources are interpreted by the Indian judiciary as of nothing but natural resources. But for the use of the natural resources, the human being is not able to take care of his social, political and economical needs. That is the reason with which the Justice Krishna Iyer has identified the material resources as national wealth. Constitutional mandate concerning the biodiversity, and which is nothing but part and parcel of the environment, is identified by Article 21, Article 48A, Article 51AG and Article 51C. What are these articles? Article 21 is interpreted by the Indian judiciary as of including the right to wholesome environment. Article 48A, which is a directive principle of state policy, which is to be practiced by the state in the name of fundamental principle of governance, is requiring the state to prioritize the environment. Article 51AG, which is a fundamental duty of the Indian citizen, requiring the Indian citizen to give the top priority to the environment through protection, conservation, preservation, etc., and also to have the compassionate feeling for the various items in the nature. Then coming to Article 51C, which is also a fundamental principle of governance, requiring the state, inclusive of all the three agencies, lawmaking agency, law implementing agency and law enforcing agency, to see that they respect the international treaties, conventions, etc. And at the international level, we have number of conventions pertaining to environment, around 800 and odd so, which are speaking about prioritizing the environment. Then Article 253, which is a procedural aspect requiring the Indian Parliament to incorporate the theme of the international conventions of any subject or on any subject to be incorporated into national law by introducing a local law to the effect that the international conventions are given a force in the country of India. Before we proceed further with the topic, let us identify the concept of ecosystem. In what way ecosystem is related to biodiversity, how the nature has been constituted, and what is the function of the nature. If we are not able to have the answer to these questions, I think we may not be able to properly appreciate the biodiversity. So, I would like to introduce you the minimum knowledge about the ecosystem so that the topic which is reflected in this particular presentation is being properly appreciated. And for the purpose of our understanding, ecosystem is classified into biotic and abiotic. This classification is only for the purpose of facilitating the understanding, but nothing more than that. And biotic items can be classified further into producers and consumers. Consumers can be further classified into primary, secondary and decomposers. Coming to abiotic, which are nothing but non-living things according to our limited understanding. But in fact, every item in the nature has got a life. Then these abiotic substances, according to our understanding, can be classified into climatic items and chemical substances like solid, water, etc. And these chemical substances once again be classified into organic and inorganic substances. Under organic, we have carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins. Under inorganic substances, we have water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, minerals like phosphates, nitrates. This is with reference to structure of the ecosystem. Coming to function of the ecosystem. These producers, which are the part of the biotic items, produce the food with the help of the climatic conditions, which are nothing but temperature, rain, etc., and take the help of chemical substances in the name of organic and both inorganic substances, and produce the food by undergoing a process by name photosynthesis. And that produce, which is produced by the producers in the name of fruits, flowers, leaves, root nodules, etc., etc., consumed by the consumer in the name of primary or secondary consumer. These consumed food, which has been consumed by the consumers, will be digested and they will be providing the energy so that these primary or secondary consumers undergo their respective role in the ecosystem, and then at the end of the lifetime of the respective consumer, The decomposers consume those bodies, and these decomposers have been given a definite role in the ecosystem, wherein they convert the organic substances into inorganic substances. And after the death of the decomposers, when they have been once again merged into the various items in the nature, these organic substances and inorganic substances once again gets deposited in the environment, and those items will be once again consumed by the consumer for the purpose of producing the food. So that means producers are acting as a suppliers of energy, which is nothing but the driving force for the function of the ecosystem. When the structure is being specified in the nature, and that structure is defined with a definite function to be discharged, and that is how the ecosystem undertakes a kind of a cycle function, a function which is in the name of a chain reaction, is required to be continued with. Then only we are able to have our requirements fulfilled through the help of the nature. Otherwise, the nature may not be able to help the human being. So here the human being's role is confined to consumer. He can't produce the food. He can't create any item in the nature. He can't convert any item from one substance into another substance. So his role is merely confined to the consumer, but not more than that. So having the identification of his role, it is the requirement given in the nature that he should discharge the respective role only, and he should not enter into the role of any other item. With the understanding of the structure and function of ecosystem, let us proceed further into the topic for the purpose of knowing what is biodiversity, what are the types of biodiversity, what is the definition of biodiversity given under the International Convention and as well under the national legislation. Let us identify the importance of biodiversity and what is its intrinsic value. What are the threats that are caused to the biodiversity by the human being? What kind of law that has been enacted at the international level? And what is the national law which is handling the biodiversity? And what was the ancient Indian approach to biodiversity? And at the end, we would like to identify what kind of mechanism we need to adopt, which is required to be undertaken by us on an urgent basis. For the purpose of identifying the technical meaning of the biodiversity, first of all, let us have a clarity what is its understanding so far as common parlance is concerned. The same understanding has been incorporated in the name of a statutory definition with certain technicalities. Then, what is biodiversity? It is nothing but life supported on planet Earth in many shapes, forms and sizes, consisting of variety of life, indicating overall health of our planet. It is nothing but all forms of life on the planet Earth, in the name of plants, in the name of microorganisms, in the name of animals, in the name of bacteria, virus, whatnot. All these things fall under the category of the biodiversity. Biodiversity, which is provided by the nature to us, that is consumer, is in the name of four types. One is genetic, species, ecological and functional. Under genetic type of biodiversity, we can take the example of different human beings. Under species type of biodiversity, we can take the example of polar bear. So that means in one part of the globe, we have a bear which is commonly known as. And when you reach the polar area, the polar bear will be having some kind of a distinguished features with that of the bear which is available elsewhere. That is species diversity. Then ecological biodiversity, variety of forests, deserts, etc., etc. We have number of variety of forests. They fall under ecological biodiversity. Then functional biodiversity, energy circuits. Why we need to have the knowledge of the types of biodiversity? The knowledge of type of biodiversity will identify the decision-making power of the human being to have a proper understanding as to what kind of mechanism he needs to adopt for the purpose of conservation of the respective biodiversity. Coming to the definition part of biodiversity as under the international convention as well as under the national legislation. The definition provided on the screen with reference to white color is a statutory definition of the Indian legislation. Then the letters that are written in the red color are the letters which are in addition to the white color words which is there in the convention of biodiversity. Then why the distinction is carried out? The definition in the convention is varying from the definition of the Indian law. In fact, the Indian definition is concising the definition as it is there under the international convention. The reason being is that we would like to take out some kind of a expansion of the definition which is practiced in the international convention. Then exactly the statutory definition in India. The variability among all living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are part and includes diversity within species or between species and of ecosystem. Then coming to conventional definition, it is extending the scope of the biodiversity, specifying that it includes inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystem. Then why we have omitted these part? So far as our national legislation is concerned, we need not have a specification as to it is inclusive of all terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystem. Why? Because when it is specified that it is a variability of all living organisms, irrespective of the terrestrial and other aquatic ecosystems, we take care of all kinds of biodiversity wherever it is found. That is the reason with which those words have been omitted so far as the national legislation is concerned. And though they are omitted, it is nothing to do so far as the practical application of the law is concerned to all kinds of systems of ecosystem. Importance of the biodiversity will make us to identify how much of priority that should be given to the biodiversity. In fact, biodiversity is the source of all resources for life. That means without biodiversity, we cannot have the life. It takes care of generation of the soil. It takes care of quality of soil, water, air and other components of nature. It also has got the competency to have a control of the pests. It has got the capacity to have the assimilation of the waste. It supplies the energy in various forms to the various items in the required proportionate ratio. And it takes care of the climatic stabilization in such a way that we are able to have the comfortable atmosphere throughout 365 days. It is also providing for some kind of a remedial measures in the name of medicines whenever our health gets disturbed. Not only the health of the human being, but the health of all the items in the nature. Then it takes care of the social and economical requirement of the human being, wherein it is providing us the generative capacity of the income. Not only that, apart from our social and economical expectations, it takes care of our spiritual and cultural advancement also. It takes care of our ethical behavior. It takes care of our aesthetic sense, which is being satisfied with the help of the nature, wherein we are able to continue with our various forms of life. Then we have preservation and conservation of the nature for future generations. How come this preservation and conservation is being adopted by the biodiversity? Yes, definitely. What all the biodiversity which our previous generations were having is being extended to us also. That means nature is taking the responsibility of maintaining the contents of the nature, maintaining the function of the nature in such a way that it is able to have the equitable distribution of the natural resources to all the future, present and previous generations. And such kind of a normal phenomena the nature is undertaking, irrespective of the life form. Is it not supposed to be practiced by the modern man? We need to look into the intrinsic value of the biodiversity because of the reason that human being has got one tendency. Unless and until he identifies the value of a particular item, he will not be identifying what kind of attitude he needs to have while interacting with the respective item. For example, if it is a diamond he is in possession of, he gives maximum care to take care of that particular diamond. If it is a commonly available item, that too abundantly available item, he doesn't bother for the security of the respective item and the care he needs to extend to such item. So that is the reason with which I would like to put forth before you the intrinsic value of the biodiversity, so that human being decides himself, identifies himself as to what kind of attitude he needs to have while he is interacting with the biodiversity. It has got ecological value, it has got genetic value, social value, economic value, scientific value, educational value, cultural value, recreational and aesthetic value. When these many number of values are available, being passed on by the biodiversity to the human being, can the human being dare enough to avoid the interaction in a proper manner? How come we need to now study about the biodiversity, its value, its importance, and the law which we need to practice so far as biodiversity is concerned? Because the man, while he is having his actions undertaken without proper understanding of the environment, has indulged into so many activities, unknowingly he has caused the threat to the biodiversity. And unless and until we identify what kind of acts on part of the human being has resulted into the present state of affairs concerning the biodiversity, then we may not be able to have our attitude modified. So for the purpose of identifying what kind of modification is required in the human lifestyle, we need to identify how come the man has caused the threat to the biodiversity. I would like to name some before you so that our understanding will be in a proper manner. Over-exploitation of natural resources, destruction of ecosystem, defective developmental policy, illegal interference with ecosystem, pollution resulting into climatic change, global warming, ozone depletion, etc., illegal trade with nature through wildlife, mining, etc., poor environmental ethics, policy and law, greed than need governing consumption of nature, failure to identify human role in nature, lifestyle of the human being. You may question me saying that how these kind of activities have posed the threat to the biodiversity. Take for example, when the human being is not able to appreciate the significance of the nature, naturally he will be under the impression that he can make use of the nature according to his whims and fancies. That is how he make use of air conditioners, he make use of motor vehicles, he make use of the consumption of the natural resources without any limitation, without any prohibition. Naturally, all these chlorofluorocarbons, excess emission of the carbons, and when he is not interacting with the nature in the light of the sustainable development, naturally there will be some kind of impact on the environment, and that impact may not be within the position of the environment to withstand. So there is a limitation for the nature also to receive. When it is beyond the limitation, nature may not be able to have its structure continuously evolve in the same spirit. Naturally, when structure is not being evolved in the same spirit with which nature has provided it, obviously the function gets disturbed. When the function gets disturbed, naturally we will be having these many problems. And one more example to have a proper understanding is that global warming. How the global warming occurs? The carbon emission is required to, the presence of the carbon in the nature is required at a proportionate ratio, so as to trap the ultraviolet rays on the planet Earth's atmosphere to have the evolution of the life. Take for example, human being is required to have a minimum temperature, without which we say that that body is not holding a life and we treat that body as a dead body. But the same carbon emissions, if cross the limitation which is required to be there on the Earth's atmosphere, naturally traps more amount of temperature on the planet Earth. If the temperature is so excessive, the human being as well as the various other life forms may not be able to withstand that temperature, and naturally the various functions gets disturbed. And that is how this global warming ultimately results into ice melting, sea level rising, change of climatic conditions in such a way that we need to have long summer, long winter, etc., etc. So all these things are negative impact on account of the human being interaction with the nature without any specification, without any limitations, without proper appreciation of the structure and function of ecosystem. Right from 1950 onwards, international law on the nature has been developed, wherein around 870 documents are right now in force, taking care of various dimensions of nature, inclusive of biodiversity. But we can't refer to all of them now through this presentation. I would like to refer to you only certain items which are a latest one. Stockholm Declaration 1972, Rio Declaration 1992, Convention on BD 1992, under which we have subsidiary documents to referred under this presentation. One is Cartagena Protocol 2003, another one is Nagoya Protocol 2010. Then I am going to refer to Ramsar Convention 1971, and then COP11 Hyderabad 2012, which is nothing but a governing body meeting held in Hyderabad under the Convention on Biodiversity. Then we will be referring to Sustainable Development 2002 Convention also. Stockholm Declaration 1972, which is an international agreement entered under the banner of the United Nations, signed by all the members of the international community around 193, prescribes two kinds of responsibilities. One is to be discharged by the individual, another one is to be discharged by the states. Individual is imposed with an obligation to have the careful planning concerning the nature, maintenance of the nature, safeguarding of the nature, wise employment of the nature, and he has to stop the pollution and heat release in the environment. States' responsibility as prescribed through the Stockholm Declaration 1972 is with reference to no sea pollution, favorable living environment, sustainable development, sustainable consumption, planning for human settlement, population control, establishing national institutions, adoption of science and technology, fixing liability, value system, hazardous activity. That means the nations have to develop their policies, their legislations, their implementation strategies and all in consonance with this particular declaration, in respect of which the agreement was being undertaken by the international members by identifying the significance of the environment, and they have set themselves a target that they need to achieve back once again the human environment. While Rio Declaration 1992, the international community would like to have a new and equitable global partnership, and they would like to have integrity of global environment. They would like to practice intergenerational equity as a doctrine. Then they would like to have a precautionary principle and polluter principles to be practiced for the purpose of undertaking certain activities which may pose a serious threat to the environment. And in fact, they would like to have the environmental impact assessment comprehensively done for the purpose of having their decision-making power exercised in the light of ecosystem functionality. Then they would like to have the participation given to the women, youth and local people with an expectation, with an understanding that women, youth and local people may be able to give their contribution for the betterment of the environment from the destructive role the human being has had against the environment. The Convention on Biological Diversity 1992 is insisting the international community in the name of an agreement stating that conservation of biodiversity should be a top priority. It has to minimize the threat to the biodiversity. It is requiring the international members not to take a defense that there is an absence of scientific certainty, and it is requiring the public education. Why? Because without education, we cannot have the compliance of the specification. Then it is requiring the member nations to have the access to the genetic resources for its proper administration. but not for simply having the commercial exploitation of the biological diversity. And it would like to require the community to have the top priority given to the biodiversity. Then the COP, that means Conference of Parties, is to be regularly conducted, which is for the purpose of the practical implementation of the convention. That means the governing body of this convention is in the name of Conference of Parties, and this Conference of Parties have been imposed with a function to advise the periodically so that the implementation is being put into practice very effectively. Then it has to have the periodical reports with the COP so that they review the implementation. Then no reservations also is required to be undertaken by the members. That means they should not claim any exemption or exceptions for the purpose of implementation of the biodiversity. Ramsar Convention, which was entered into by the international community in the year 1971, takes care of wetland protection. What does it mean? The wetland in a particular country is the source and power of all the international members, not only of the present generation but of the future generation. That means the countries which are holding the wetlands are not expected to handle those wetlands according to their political governance over the respective territory, but they have to take care of those wetlands for the purpose of the entire universe, not only of the present generation but of the future generation. Cartagena Protocol, which has been entered into by the international community in the year 2003, is in the name of subsidiary document to the Convention on Biological Diversity, dealing with certain items by name biosafety, advance inform agreement, and control of LMOs. What does it mean and what it is specifically mentioning about the biodiversity? It would like to insist upon the biosafety. What is biosafety? Bio is nothing but a life. Life in the various forms of ecosystem, whether it is aqua or terrestrial as the case may be, should be protected in such a way that no foreign item in the sense an item from the different ecosystem should not be introduced in this ecosystem, because the structure of the ecosystem gets disturbed, thereby disturbing the function of the ecosystem. While it is so, living modified organisms, which are nothing but human generated items, human interfered items, which are in the name of the laboratory project works, not to cause any kind of danger to the structure and function of a given ecosystem. If at all those LMOs are to be introduced in an ecosystem, there should be an informed agreement. That means prior to they introduced into the particular ecosystem, the given area should be given an option to have the agreement to have such introduction in that ecosystem. Otherwise, those LMOs are not to be introduced in an ecosystem. So what does it mean? In fact, biosafety is one of the tools which can be taken care of, which is prescribing for the implementation of the Convention on Biodiversity. 11th Conference of Parties to the Biodiversity Convention, which was held in Hyderabad in the year 2012, will be discussing the implementation of the Biodiversity Convention principles. And after its deliberations, it has come to a resolution stating that double funding from developed countries should be extended to developing countries for implementation of Biodiversity Convention. Then it is also identifying that sustainable management of the oceans is one of the targets to be practiced by the international community. Then it has to factor the biodiversity into environmental impact assessment by all the member nations. That is the reason with which the environmental impact assessment has been incorporated with the concept of biodiversity, which is inclusive of various items like plants, animals, etc. Then biodiversity is to be realized but not to be sought. Green economy should be practiced. That means biodiversity should be part and parcel of the economic decisions or economic actions. Then it has to in the sense international community should have the national strategies developed. Like that, there are number of strategies specified through that conference of parties, which are in the name of NBSAP, TEEB, etc., etc. The Convention on Sustainable Development, entered into in the year 2002 by the international community, is taking care of two aspects which are connected to the biodiversity only. It is requiring that rich diversity for sustainable development. That means biodiversity should be used only for the purpose of sustainable development. Then what is meant by sustainable development? Sustainable development is nothing but the development that is practiced by the present generation while fulfilling the needs of the present generation, but not compromising the needs of the future generation to meet their basic needs. That means as we are making use of the natural resources in a particular quality and quantity being passed on by the previous generation, who are none other than our ancestors, should be passed on to the future generation in the same quality and in the same quantity, so that the future generation also fulfill their needs as we are fulfilling our needs. Then coming to the another dimension which is prescribed under that convention is corporate accountability. So the international community has an understanding that the corporates who are consuming the natural resources for the purpose of their profit has to take the accountability, because but for the consumption of the natural resources they are not able to get the profits, and they are getting the profits on account of the consumption of the natural resources, that too by posing a threat to the environment. Are they not expected to take the responsibility? That corporate accountability has been prescribed as one of the principles to be practiced by the international community, which takes care of the biodiversity in the name of a precautionary principle and polluter pays principle. Nagoya Protocol, entered into by the international community in the year 2010, is one more a subsidiary document to the Convention on Biodiversity. And this Nagoya Protocol is with reference to the biodiversity which is required to be conserved in such a way that it has formulated certain principles. One is that incentives for conservation. That means whoever is furthering the conservation of the biodiversity should be provided with some kind of an incentive, so that the human being is able to insist upon the conservation. That means unless and until something is given, the human being has got a tendency not to practice. So to have some kind of a incentive extended to the human being, Nagoya Protocol is taking care of that issue. Then it is requiring that the traditional knowledge should be given a top priority. What is meant by traditional knowledge? The communities which are having their existence in a given ecosystem are having the maximum amount of the knowledge pertaining to the various items, their purpose, their structure, their function, etc. So they should be given a kind of a concern wherein their traditional knowledge should be utilized for the bona fide purpose of consuming the biodiversity. Then if the biodiversity is to be utilized for certain purposes, including the commercial purposes, then it has to be given a kind of consent. That means the local community in the name of biodiversity community is required to give a consent for the purpose of making use of that biodiversity. Then why should they give a consent? Because they are the proper persons. They are the people who has got a traditional knowledge on account of which they are able to identify whether that resource is a renewable resource or a non-renewable resource. What is the extent of that resource that is available? What is its importance? What is its significance? When you know the knowledge pertaining to the respective item, naturally you will be identifying what kind of consumption you need to adopt with reference to such biodiversity. So for the purpose of taking a proper decision and proper attitude to be developed in respect of the consumption of such biodiversity, it is insisted through Nagoya Protocol that without prior informed consent, access to biodiversity should not be permitted by the member nations. Then it is also requiring the research activity that may be undertaken pertaining to biodiversity with reference to two purposes. One is to have the conservation of the biodiversity in a comprehensive manner, and another one is to make the international community aware of the knowledge pertaining to the biodiversity so that their actions are in consonance with the conservation of the biodiversity. Then coming to food security. Food is nothing but an energy which is the driving force of the ecosystem, and that food is to be taken care in such a way that we need to continuously get that energy so that our evolution, our growth, our developmental activities are not hampered. Then we have sharing subject to mutual agreement. That means if a particular ecosystem has to share its biodiversity with that of the other ecosystem, that is the people who are having the political control over such an area have to have a mutual agreement without which it should not be permitted. It should not be means the consumption of the natural resource should not be permitted. Then we need to have the monitoring of the utilization of the biodiversity. Why we need to monitor? If we are not monitoring, the consumption may be unlimited, may be haphazard, may be creating a threat to the biodiversity so that it is extincting ultimately. Then we need to have national focal points. This concept of national focal points will require the international community to have that how much of biodiversity is available, which can be consumed by how many people without damaging the future generations' needs, without interfering the future generation needs. For that purpose, we need to have some kind of a record in the name of a national focal point. Then capacity building is also insisted in the Nagoya Protocol. What is meant by capacity building? The member nations who are consuming the biodiversity are required to have the understanding that to what extent they are having the capacity to have the consumption or to have the conservation of the biodiversity, and if they are not having the amount of knowledge that is required, that knowledge is to be acquired by them while conducting a research, while getting a technical knowledge from the respective institutions, scientific experiments, etc., etc., so that everybody is able to ultimately achieve the target with which Convention on Biodiversity has been entered into by the international community. Coming to Indian law on biodiversity, we have around 35 legislation in India directly and indirectly handling the biodiversity. One legislation is directly concerning with the biodiversity, that is the Biological Diversity Act 2002, which is in consonance with the Biodiversity Convention 1992. Then we have another legislation, Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act 2002, which is discussing something about the species of the plant varieties and the farmers who are into the conservation of those plant varieties on account of the ancestors. They have passed on this knowledge to the future generation of the farming community, which is not to be interfered with by the human activities. Then we have one legislation by name, in the name of delegated legislation, Plant Quarantine, Regulation of Import into India Order 2003, which is requiring the permission from the Indian government while introducing any plant varieties into India which may pose a threat to the Indian biodiversity in the name of plants. Then we have another legislation by name Food Safety and Standards Act 2006, wherein the nutrient food is required to be taken care in such a way that the standard of the food is not disturbed through human intervention. Then we have one legislation, Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers, Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006, which is providing for recognition of the rights of the forest dwellers to have their residence, to have the access to the forest resources, with an understanding that the tribals are having the inherent right to reside in the habitat by name forest, and their interaction with the forest will fetch the forest area to be conserved because they are the proper people to identify what kind of conservation mechanism to be practiced concerning the wildlife, which is nothing but having its habitat in the forest area. Then we have Environment Protection Act 1986. We have Forest Conservation Act 1980, which is requiring the forest area not to be converted into non-forest purpose. Then we have Patents Act 1970, which has been linked with the Biodiversity Act in such a way that while obtaining a patent, and that patent is incorporating the process wherein the biodiversity will be utilized, they have to mention the source of the biodiversity, whether they got the permission from the concerned agency to make use of that biodiversity, then only they will be granted with a patent, otherwise no. Then we have Seeds Act 1966, which is taking care of the non-interference of the human being into the seeds, its structure, quality, etc. Then coming to Destructive Insects and Pests Act 1914, which is requiring the non-interference of the human being while these insects and pests are being controlled during the farming activity with a chemical substance, etc. Then we have Wildlife Protection Act 1972, requiring the habitat protection as well as the animal protection inclusive of specified plant. Then we have the various rules concerning the rules for manufacture, use, import, export and storage of hazardous microorganisms, genetically engineered organisms or cells in the year 1989, wherein the biosafety is taken care through the delegated legislation. Coming to the Biological Diversity Act 2002, enacted in India as under Article 253 by the Parliament for the purpose of giving force to the theme with which it has entered into the International Convention on Biodiversity 1992. We would like to have the scope of the salient features, scheme, objectives, exemptions, authorities, functions of the authorities, who are the benefit claimers, etc., etc., through this presentation, so that we will be able to appreciate exactly what kind of requirement is from the Indian citizen while he is interacting with the biodiversity in India. Before looking into the operation of the Biological Diversity Act 2002, we need to identify its salient features. Salient features are nothing but the scheme of the law, what kind of activities that are taken care under this particular legislation. The first issue that is taken care under this legislation in the name of a specification that it regulates the access to biological resources. For what purpose? For equitable sharing with its associated knowledge. That means while one is consuming the biological resources, he will be regulated upon so that his consumption is not interfering with the consumption by the another person of the same generation and also the future generation. Then not only the consumption of the biological resource is regulated, but the knowledge of the biological resource is also regulated. That means that knowledge cannot be passed on to the people who may make use of that knowledge for the purpose of posing a threat to the biodiversity. So that means the traditional knowledge should not be extended beyond its requirement, that too for commercial purpose, because once the commercial purpose is permitted, that will not be stopping, and in fact it may lead to the extinction of the very natural resource. The another feature of this legislation is it will be providing for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. How come? It is specifying that if a biodiversity is limitedly available, better we need to have a prohibition, and the limited amount of biodiversity should be utilized in such a way that we continue to have that amount of biodiversity throughout all the generations. In such a way, our consumption should be restricted. Our consumption should be specified one. That is what another feature. Then the third feature is The respect is extended to the traditional knowledge, and the protection is also extended to the traditional knowledge, so that the knowledge concerning that biodiversity is being taken care in such a way that it is not misused, wherein it is ultimately resulting into the extinction of the biodiversity. Then, the benefits that are arising out of the consumption of the biological resources as well as its allied products should be shared with the people who are into protection of such biodiversity, who are into holding the traditional knowledge of that biodiversity for the purpose of passing on it to the future generations. Then, protection of biodiversity heritage sites. So that means this legislation is providing for recognizing certain areas which are ecologically sensitive and whose biodiversity is to be given a due protection, that will be identified in the name of BHS, Biodiversity Heritage Site, wherein the regulation of the human activity is to the optimum level so that we achieve the target of this legislation. Then we have another feature in the name of protection and rehabilitation of threatened species. So there are certain species which have already been facing the threatening from the human being, and this legislation is providing for protection as well as rehabilitation while encouraging the research into the respective threatened species for the purpose of improving their number, improving their quality, so that we continues to have such biodiversity without extinction. Then we need to recognize the local bodies so far as the biodiversity consumption as well as utilization and the experimentation on the biodiversity, etc. is concerned, because it is the local body which may be the proper body to have its influence over proper decisions. Interaction with biodiversity in India by the human being is prescribed with a scheme through this particular legislation. And this scheme is twofold one. One is conservation of biodiversity. Another one is sustainable use of biodiversity. The sustainable use of biodiversity is with further specification concerning the biological resources as well its associated knowledge. So that means consumption of resources and its associated knowledge should be undertaken only through the four mechanisms that are permitted through this legislation. One is commercial purpose, another one is research, then biosurvey and bioutilization. But these four undertakings can be only through the framework which is to be specified in the name of access to biological resources and sharing the benefits arising out of such access through a governing program by name transfer of research results and application for the intellectual property right relating to Indian biological resources. The three objectives of this legislation are conservation, sustainable use, fair and equitable sharing. Conservation of biodiversity in India is prescribed through this Biodiversity Act 2002 in the following manner. It is prescribing a regulation for the access to the biodiversity via its provision number section 3. The regulation is insisted in a way that the Indian national is having the option to make use of the biodiversity without any restriction unless and until it is required for a commercial purpose. Other than the commercial purpose, he can make use of it for medicinal purposes, for conventional use. For example, we make use of so many items while we cook the food. So for having access to those items, we need not obtain anybody's permission. Then coming to foreign nationals who would like to make use of the biodiversity, they have to take the permission from all the agencies, right from National Biodiversity Board, State Biodiversity Board and the Biodiversity Management Committee, which is at the local level for the access. Then they need to have a research program also to be undertaken through the collaborative research programs along with the consent of the Union of India. Otherwise, they cannot have the research. So that means only the Indian nationals are permitted to have the access to the biodiversity, but not the foreign nationals, unless and until they enter into collaborative research project with Central Government of India. Then coming to transfer of results of research as under Section 4. The research results can be transferred subject to the condition that they take the permission from the concerned agencies under this particular legislation. Otherwise, they cannot transfer. This regulation is insisted upon to see that it is not, that means the knowledge of biodiversity is not falling under the hands of the foreign nationals, so that they pose a threat to the extinction of the biodiversity. Then coming to research. Research will be obviously promoted with reference to two dimensions. One is to have the conservation of the biodiversity. Another one is what kind of approach we need to have depending upon their availability, the extent and the purpose of the respective biodiversity and its traditional knowledge. Then regulation of patenting is prescribed through Section 6. That means when a person would like to have an intellectual property right granted by the concerned agency under the Patents Act of India, they need to get the prior permission from the National Biodiversity Authority, without which they cannot be granted with a patent. Then, concerning the obtaining of the biological resource, prior intimation is to be given to the Biodiversity Management Committee. In fact, they need to give a consent without which they cannot make use of the biological resource, because it is only the Biodiversity Management Committee which is imposed with an accountability under this particular legislation to have the conservation of biodiversity and also to identify what kind of acts that can be undertaken pertaining to the biodiversity available in the given ecosystem. That is the ecosystem over which they have been given a governing power. Then coming to determination on EBS under 21 of this legislation. What is meant by EBS? Equitable benefit sharing. The people who are categorized into benefit claimers under this particular legislation, that means the person in that particular ecosystem who has got the knowledge of that biodiversity as to its structure, as to its function, as to its target in the nature, is to be given a benefit extended to him in the name of means of livelihood, or in the names of royalty, or in the name of any other equitable sharing with reference to exploitation of that biodiversity. Then, if they require any expert advice, to that extent also expert body may be constituted, not only for the purpose of regulating the biodiversity of the given ecosystem over which they have got a governing power, but also to identify what kind of mechanism they need to adopt for the purpose of regulation, and also to maintain the biodiversity register. They need to maintain a register, and wherein all the details will be there as to what kind of structure of the biodiversity with which we can identify the respective biodiversity, and how much of that item is available, who are using it, to what extent they are having the sharing with reference to such consumption, who are they and how they are permitted, how much they can extract that biodiversity resource. All these things will be identified in that particular register. Then they need to have a regulation of consumption of biodiversity as under Section 24. What does it mean? The consumption will be regularized. For example, we have a particular amount of biodiversity. If we start consuming it without any regulation, it will be exhausted within a short span of time. So for that purpose, depending upon the quantum, depending upon the nature of the resource, whether it's a renewable resource or non-renewable resource, we need to have the regulation over the consumption. That is what specified under Section 24 of this legislation. Then this legislation is also requiring the conservation in the name of sustainable management under Section 36. What is sustainable management? So while we are consuming, while we are undertaking various interactions with the biodiversity, we need to manage them in such a way that it will be continued to have its existence and function even for the benefit of the future generations. Then this legislation is prescribing under Section 37 for the purpose of identifying the biodiversity heritage sites with the help of the local bodies of that area to be undertaken by the state government and state biodiversity boards to be ultimately accepted, or a kind of consent that should be extended by the national biodiversity, so that a specific protection is extended to that area for the purpose of the interactions of the human being to be regulated upon in all the dimensions. Then we have one more concept through a conservation program, that is notifying the threatened species. So the items which are already facing the danger at the hands of the human being are to be notified, while Section 38 is requiring, so that the mechanism to continue with that threatened species, that means we would like to take those threatened species from ICU to the normal parlance, normal scenario of the nature, so that we once again take those species into the normal functioning in the ecosystem. And under this legislation, the repositories recognition and registration is also provided under Section 39. Till date, we have identified 13 institutions as repositories under this legislation. What is the function these repositories will be undertaking? These repositories will be holding the record of the biodiversity by having the genetic composition deposited with them, whoever are using the respective biological resource, or on its own these repositories will try to make a gene bank of the particular species, so that the future generations will be able to identify what kind of biodiversity we were having once upon a time, whether the same amount of same quality of biodiversity has been passed on, and what is its purpose, what is the theme of the nature in having the respective items. So all these 12 instances, or all these 12 kind of schemes that are prescribed under this legislation are ultimately targeting the conservation of the biodiversity in their respective dimension, to see that the Indian biodiversity is conserved for the future generations, not only of India but of the future entire universe. Sustainable use of biodiversity is permitted under the BD Act 2002 in India, subject to a condition that the one who would like to make use of that bioresource should have an agreement to the extent of equitable benefit sharing, without which one is not permitted to have the use of the biodiversity except for conventional or medicinal purposes, that too by the Indian citizen. Okay, then what is meant by equitable benefit sharing as provided under Section 21? Equitable benefit sharing is identified through 3 programs. One is levy of charges for consumption as under Section 41, Class 3. Who will be identifying these charges to be paid by the one who would like to make use of the biological resource? It is the Biodiversity Management Committee with the consent of the State Biodiversity Board and National Biodiversity Board, in consonance with the rules that are framed under the legislation, will be identifying what amount of charges that should be imposed. And these charges, which are being paid by the concerned person who will be using the biological resource, will be deposited into the fund that is to be organized under this legislation to be utilized for the conservation of the biodiversity. Then we have the documentation as required under Section 41, Class 1. So that means, to the extent of equitable benefit sharing, there shall be an agreement between the consumer of the biodiversity and the benefit claimers, and that document shall hold the list of the benefit claimers also, and that amount which is required to be extended to the benefit claimers shall be deposited as per the specifications by the concerned biodiversity authorities. Then it should also have the care for the conservation as required under Section 41(1). So unless and until these 3 items are taken care through an equitable benefit sharing agreement, which should be entered into in between the consumer of the biodiversity and the benefit claimers as recognized under this particular legislation. The use is not permitted through our national legislation, which is also nothing but sustainable use only. In the universe right now, we have around 193 nations. Among these 193 nations, in 12 countries only, we have maximum amount of biodiversity. When the international community has had a convention on biological diversity in the year 1992, they would like to have a fair and equitable sharing of this biodiversity, which is maximum available within 12 countries, to be extended to the rest of the countries who are not being provided with the maximum amount of biodiversity. Then this fair and equitable sharing, which is one of the principles at the International Convention, has been brought into Indian legislation by the India because India has been the signatory to the convention. The fair and equitable sharing of biodiversity is specified in India through benefits as well as knowledge. The benefits will be extended to all the benefit claimers through 6 programs. One is joint ownership as under section 21(2). That means all the benefit claimers may be extended with the joint ownership with the person who is actually consuming the biological resource. Then why he need to share? Because but for the benefit claimers, he would not have had the access to the biodiversity, thereby ultimately deriving the benefits out of the same. So that is the reason with which he needs to have the sharing of the ownership jointly with that of the benefit claimers. That is one kind of project work that can be undertaken wherein the benefits are extended fairly and equitably to all the concerned people. Then the another activity or another scheme that is provided under this legislation is insisting that the Association of Indian Scientists and the benefit claimers and the local people. So that means without the involvement of the Indian scientist, without the involvement of the benefit claimer, without the involvement of the local people, the consumption of the biodiversity may not be permitted as it is prescribed under section 21(2), depending upon the specified circumstance which is existing from case to case, which varies from case to case. Then this equitable and benefit sharing is also provided through a mechanism by name transfer of technology under section 21 class 2, wherein the one who has got a technology with reference to consumption of biodiversity should pass it on to the required category of people so that the consumption will be not against the basic principles of conservation of biodiversity. Then it is also insisting that the venture capital also may be designed while the consumption of the BD is undertaken by a person with reference to all the benefit claimers as under section 21 class 2. Another kind of program also is provided as an option while sharing the benefits with the benefit claimers, which is nothing but as under section 21(2) to have the improvement of the local standards. So this provision is insisting that as far as possible, the consumption of the biodiversity may be undertaken within the respective ecosystem so that the means of livelihood may be extended to the benefit claimers or the local people as the case may be, by making them ultimately to have their standards improved upon. Then the last scheme that is provided to have the fair and equitable sharing is payment of monetary or non-monetary benefits as provided under section 21(3). And these monetary or non-monetary benefit that will be identified by all the agencies that are working with reference to consumption of the biodiversity, right from National Biodiversity Authority to Biodiversity Management Committee. This is with reference to consumption of the BD. Then about the knowledge, it is provided through 2 schemes which are there in the name of explanation to section 4 and section 7. Explanation of section 4 is specifying that the knowledge pertaining to BD shall be disseminated upon. Dissemination in the sense, while they are making use of the knowledge, how best they are using, what is the ultimate purpose which they are achieving on account of the knowledge that is shared. They have to share that information with all the benefit claimers so that the benefit claimers, if at all required with any specification, they may be participating in that program. Then coming to utilization as under section 7 also, it is insisted that while utilizing the knowledge, to what extent they are utilizing, that should be informed to the concerned people who are none other than benefit claimers, so that the benefit claimers and the consumer of the biodiversity are having the information with each other as to how they are making use of it and what is the purpose with which they are making use of it, how the knowledge is being processed into, is it in the same fashion or not, so that all these things are ultimately in furtherance with the conservation of the biodiversity. Let us identify the exemptions that are considered under this legislation for the purpose of our effective clarity. One is with reference to access and benefit sharing. Who are exempted? Indians for access, use, research, survey, medicine, growing, cultivation, except for commercial use. The traded community like ginger, tamarind, etc., wide notification excluding commercial commodity like perfumes. So that means traded commodities are also exempted from the application of this legislation. Then we have value added products of biodiversity. What is meant by value added products? The item which will be holding the compound of biodiversity which cannot be separated from the respective product, or which is not in a position to be perceived through the senses of the human being in a normal condition, those products are falling under the category of value added products of biodiversity. So we are not incorporating the value added products within the application of Biodiversity Act. Then traditional knowledge of biodiversity, if not used for commercial purpose, is totally exempted from application of this legislation. That means we can make use of the traditional knowledge of BD except for commercial purpose without being governed under this legislation. Then the rights protected under Protection of Plant Varieties Act enacted by the Parliament. That means the Protection of Plant Varieties Act is identifying certain rights. Those rights are not controlled by the provisions under BD Act. Then we have human genetic material which is available with our scientific community, which is also totally exempted from application under this legislation. That means, so far as consumption of BD by the Indians and the knowledge of the BD by the Indians, except for commercial purpose, is out of the purview of the Biodiversity Act 2002, and the rights of the farmers as under Plant Varieties Act not to be touched by this particular legislation. Human genetic material totally outside the purview of this particular legislation, wherein human genetic material can be utilized for the purpose of various accesses, various activities, because that is required to be undertaken for improving upon the conditions of the human being with reference to many number of medical problems. These are the following authorities that are concerning the implementation of the Biodiversity Act in India. At the national level, we have National Biodiversity Authority, which is at the central level to have the monitoring of the functions at the state level, which is in the name of State Biodiversity Board, and local level Biodiversity Management Committee. And this National Biodiversity Authority is an authority which has to grant the approval for the purpose of obtaining the intellectual property right, which has to advise the central and state governments as and when required with reference to what kind of approach the governments are expected to have concerning the biodiversity interaction by the human being, etc., etc. Then we have State Biodiversity Board at the state level to aid and advise the state government for the purpose of identifying the biodiversity heritage sites, for the purpose of constituting the biodiversity management committees with the help of the local community, along with the constitution of expert group to support the biodiversity management committees at the local level, etc., etc. Then we have the National Green Tribunal constituted through National Green Tribunal Act 2010, which is nothing but an appellate authority over the grievances that have been faced by the various sections of the people while the BD Act is being put into implementation. Then central government is one of the authority to take certain decisions concerning the biodiversity, especially with reference to framing of the rules, then obtaining the reports from the respective statutory bodies and placing them before the parliament and the concerned action taken report to be placed before the parliament, and while it is formulating the policy, how best the implementation of this legislation is to be furthered, all these things, development of strategies, etc., etc. To all these concerns, it is the central government which is the authorized body. Not only that, for the purpose of having the violations that are controlled upon by complaining to the concerned authorities, it is the officers of the central government that will be authorized through a notification wherein they have to complain, without which the cognizance of the matter is not to be undertaken by the judicial authorities. Then the state government is also having an authority under the legislation to have the constitution of the biodiversity management committees, state biodiversity board, and the expert group identifying the biodiversity heritage sites to have a due protection to the given area ecosystem, etc., etc. The functions of the above said authorities are to be classified in the following manner. What is the reason with which we need to have a classification of their functions? Unless and until we have their functions identified in the form of its nature, in the name of its extent, in the name of its scope, we may not be able to appreciate the way in which they have to discharge their respective functionality. That means while we are identifying the significance or the integrity of the respective function, if we know the nature of the function, that will be facilitating us to have the challenge of the function in a proper manner and see that we go for implementation of the legislation more comprehensively. The one is facilitative functions. That means they create a situation in such a way that as provided under the legislation to have the utilization of the various facilities that are provided under this legislation. To name one is the Biodiversity Management Committee is to be extended with a facility to have the support of the expert group for the purpose of maintenance of the People's Biodiversity Register and for the purpose of giving the consent for the purpose of use of the resource, etc., etc. Then we have regulatory function. In the name of regulatory function, for example, without the consent from the National Biodiversity Authority, the IPR authority, according to Patents Act 1970, cannot grant a patent where that patent is involving the usage of the biodiversity. So that means without the knowledge of the National Biodiversity Authority, the patent cannot be obtained concerning the biodiversity. Then we have advisory functions. Here, the central government and the state governments are to be advised by the respective National Biodiversity Authority and State Biodiversity Authority. So when they are extending the advice to the central or state government, the central or state government are supposed to follow that advice because it is from an expert body. So the nature of the function will fetch us, will require us, will mandate us to what kind of significance or integrity that should be attached to the respective function. Then responsible function. For example, Biodiversity Management Committee is imposed with a responsibility to identify what kind of access that should be permitted within the limitations under the law and what kind of access should not be permitted within the limitations of the law concerning the respective ecosystem. Then we have monitoring function. For example, state government and central government have been given a monitoring power. That means the state and central biodiversity boards, that is National Biodiversity Board, will be submitting the periodical reports to the concerned governments, and these periodical reports once again will be attached with the action taken report and submitted before the concerned legislature to have the control, to have the identification, and the fund, accounts, etc., are to be audited. So the auditory bodies in India, the statutory bodies in India have been authorized to have the audit conducted at a periodical timings. So all these things fall under monitoring functions. Then we have technically supportive functions through the expert bodies and all. So that means the nature of the function, when we are able to know, obviously we are able to have the discharge of such function questioned or discharged with etc., in the lines in which the statute is providing for. The benefit claimers that are identified under our Indian legislation are conservers of biological resources and its byproducts, creators and holders of knowledge and information relating to biological resource, innovations and practices associated with use and application of biological resources. I would like to remind you of what are the items that fall under biological resource. Plants, animals, microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, etc., fall under the category of biological resources. People's Biodiversity Register, which is to be maintained by the Biodiversity Management Committee, if it is required with the support of the technical group that is to be constituted in the lines of this particular legislation. The Biodiversity Management Committee, which has got a governing control over the respective ecosystem, first of all has to sensitize the people about the study that is required in the given ecosystem, the survey that is required, and the possible management that is required in the given ecosystem. And it has to train the members for the purpose of identifying and the collection of data concerning the bioresources and its traditional knowledge. Then these members who are trained by the management committee will in turn in the locality collect the data, and this data collection will be through the review of the literature on the natural resources throughout those particular territorial limitations with the help of the participatory rural appraisal program at the village level, at the household level, and at the individual interviews with the village leaders and knowledgeable individuals, household heads, key actors of the Panchayat Raj institutions and NGOs, and direct field observations. That means the trainers who have been trained by the Biodiversity Management Committee for the purpose of collection of data has to follow the respective mechanism given under this particular legislation, and that data is to be processed out, that is, it is to be analyzed and validated in the name of the register, and accordingly the technical support, if at all required, can be obtained by these particular people who are processing that particular data. Then after the processing of that data, they have to register in the name of People's Biodiversity Register, and this People's Biodiversity Register is to be kept under the control and custody of the Biodiversity Management Committee, which is prescribed with a duty not to allow the register to be accessed by each and everybody. That means Indian can access without any reservation except when it is required for a commercial purpose. Otherwise, no foreigner is permitted to look into this particular register unless and until they have got a special consent or special permission from the concerned agencies. Then this information which is recorded in the name of People's Biodiversity Register should be computerized in such a way that that information and the resource is given a due importance, that too without allowing the free access for mala fide consumption of the respective natural resource. I would like to put forth before you the biodiversity heritage sites that have been recognized in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Kondakarla Ava, which is located in the district of Visakhapatnam, is identified for the purpose of taking care of migratory birds. Then we have identified Telukunchi area falling under Srikakulam district for the sake of migratory birds. We have identified Tatipudi Reservoir in the Vijayanagaram district for the purpose of fish-foot birds. Then Katakshapur in the district of Warangal has been recognized for the purpose of migratory birds. Chintapalli area in Khammam district has been identified for the purpose of taking care of migratory birds. Chaudavaram in West Godavari has been recognized for the purpose of migratory birds. Acharya N.G. Ranga Agricultural University, situated in Rajendra Nagar of Hyderabad, has been recognized for the purpose of forest. So these are the areas which I would like to put forth before you, identified as biodiversity heritage sites as a nodal items. Till date, 13 institutes have been identified as repositories under this particular legislation in India. These repositories will play a role of nothing but gene banks. That means these institutes will be preserving the genetic features of the particular biodiversity for the purpose of future guidance to undertake the conservation program by specifying the kind of the mechanism that we need to adopt. To name some of them, Botanical Survey of India, which is there in Kolkata, which takes care of flora with reference to angiosperms, gymnosperms and pteridophytes, bryophytes, lichens, macrofungi and macroalgae. Then we have National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources, New Delhi, which takes care of plant genetic resources. Then we have National Botanical Research Institute, Lucknow, which takes care of flora with reference to angiosperms, gymnosperms, pteridophytes, Lucknow bryophytes, lichens, macrofungi and macroalgae. Then we have Indian Council of Forestry Research and Education, Dehradun, Forest Research Institute, Dehradun, Institute of Forest Genetics and Tree Breeding, Coimbatore, and Tropical Forest Research Institute, Jabalpur, which takes care of flora and fauna with reference to terminates, butterflies, moths. Then we have Geological Survey of India, Kolkata, which takes care of fauna. The violations as under Biological Diversity Act 2002 are being treated as offences. That means the serious view has been given to the violations under this legislation by treating them as an offence. And that too, these offences are cognizable offences and non-bailable offences. Then, what are the activities that are penalized under this particular legislation? One is permissible consumption, another one is transfer results of research and patenting regulation. That means if a person who is prescribed with a permission to have the consumption, then a person who is required to have the consent for the purpose of transferring the results, and a person who is required to follow a rule concerning the patenting regulation with reference to biodiversity, if he violates any of these specifications, then the imprisonment prescribed under this legislation is maximum up to 5 years or fine up to 10 lakh rupees or the fine proportionate to the damage or both as the case may be, which is laid down under section 55 class 1. Then the other two activities, they are obtaining biodiversity with prior intimation, regulation by State Biodiversity Board over prior intimation. That means when an intimation is required without the consent of the authority, if we are not permitted to make use of it, then we are prescribed with a penal liability under this legislation under section 55 class 2, which is extending the imprisonment up to 3 years or fine up to 10 lakh rupees or both as the case may be. With reference to other violations, that means the violations which are not specified under first category and the violations which are not specified under second category under section 55 class 1 and 55 class 2. For the rest of the violations, the fine prescribed is maximum up to 10 lakhs. If the same kind of violation is repeated upon, the fine up to 20 lakhs, and if that offence is being continued further for every day's continuation, per day 2 lakh rupees is to be imposed as a fine as prescribed under section 56. When a company is involving in the violation under this particular legislation, the in charge of the company is to be imposed with a liability as if he is an individual who has committed a violation as under section 57 class 1. Then the person who is involving himself in the name of giving the consent for committing a violation, in the name of being negligent for not governing the respective activity while resulting into violation under the Biodiversity Act, has to be imposed with a liability as if he is personally involving as specified under section 57 class 2, and he should also be imposed with a liability. As every legislation would be having the scheme for the purpose of achieving the target with which the respective legislation is enacted by the concerned legislature, this Biodiversity Act 2002 is having 3 targets. One is conservation of biodiversity, second one is access to biodiversity, third one is equitable and benefit sharing of the biodiversity. This legislation is also providing a scheme which we have already discussed in detail, through which it would like to achieve the objective. But I am of the opinion that the scheme provided under this legislation is having some loopholes. That means it should be provided with the following strengths so that it is ultimately achieving the target with which this legislation has been enacted. The first strength which I could able to identify is with reference to equitable and benefit sharing. This equitable benefit sharing should not be provided as a right which is there in the legislation, but it should be provided in the name of a privilege only. That means subject to certain conditions. Why? Because the human tendency has got a kind of a weakness where he would like to make the exception as a rule and rule as an exception. So, to take care of that human tendency wherein he is not defeating the purpose with which the legislation has been enacted, EBA should be provided not as a right but as a privilege. Then the second strength that is required by the BD Act is the adequate supremacy is to be extended to the biodiversity on account of its nature and scope. We also need to have effective coordination which is required for the conservation program of the biodiversity from all the concerned departments, right from common man to the state and the various institutions working on environmental issues and the adjudicatory forums working on environmental issues, so that ultimately we achieve the target of this particular legislation. Then the scheme that is provided under this particular legislation should be without any exemption or without any overpowering. There is no provision in this particular legislation which is specifying that the provisions of this legislation will have overriding effect over the provisions of the other legislation. For example, Forest Conservation Act 1980 is providing for conversion of the forest area for non-forest purposes through a constitution of committee under the central government, and if it is approving, the forest area can be converted for non-forest purpose. If such kind of a conversion is permissible under that legislation and the BD Act is not given an overriding effect, obviously the BD Act will be defeated. So, overriding effect should be given to the Biodiversity Act. Then, with reference to adjudicatory power under this particular legislation, we need to identify the orders under this particular legislation to be extended with the status of a decree so that those orders are easily in a position to be implemented upon by every authority whoever is required to have the implementation of the respective order, which is not extended under this legislation. Then the next strength which is required by this legislation is the liability that has not been fixed proportionately as per the requirement. So the enforcement machinery is to be imposed with a proportional liability, then only we will be able to have the accountability created among the various sections of the concerned people for the purpose of achieving the conservation program, which is a top priority under the international convention. Then we have enforcement of Article 21 to be practiced through this particular legislation also. How that can be achieved? That can be achieved in case these offences are made as non-cognizable offences. What does it mean by? For example, under this legislation, if any violation is committed, the officers authorized by the central government via its notification are required to give a notice, wait for the period for remedy, and then only they have to report the matter to the judicial authority. If this kind of a mechanism is prescribed, naturally there is a scope for lobbying with the respective officers not to report the matter to the concerned judicial authority. When such kind of a scope for lobbying is created or facilitated through this legislation, where is the question of enforcement of Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which is being identified by the Supreme Court as of including the right to wholesome environment? The statutory bodies that are created under the Biodiversity Act 2002 are being extended with the status of welfare body. But in fact, they are not to be treated merely as welfare bodies, because they are the expert bodies constituted for the respective purpose. And if we extend the status of an expert body, obviously their decisions will be binding on us. To have the creation of the bindingness, so far as the advice given by these statutory bodies, we need to treat them as an expert body whose decisions are binding on the concerned sections of the people. Then we have one more strength which is required to be extended to this particular legislation is the absolute implementation. So that means we should not leave any scope for non-implementation of the legislation, because it is only the enforcement which facilitates the implementation of the law, but not leaving a scope for non-implementation. Then we need to have the comprehensive policy designed for the purpose of conservation. No doubt in India we have policies, especially in the name of strategies also, to have the conservation of the biody, but that is not put into practice, where all the ministries have been insisted upon to get the approval of the concerned environmental ministry for the purpose of having any kind of interaction with the biodiversity. Then we need to have due appreciation of biodiversity due to our Indian culture. When we have our culture which is in consonance with the ecosystem, why can't we promote? If we insist upon the Indian culture to be practiced by every person, whoever is residing in India, concerning the biodiversity, obviously we need not have these many number of laws, because Indian culture has designed the human lifestyle in such a way that we automatically practice all these specifications without any reservation, without any exception, without any kind of a deviation. Then we need to have the regulation of bureaucratic hurdle, because the BD is a subject which is required to be given a top priority, which is not to be attacked by a bureaucratic hurdle. Then we need to remove that also. Then incorporation of value added projects. For example, when we are caring for the biodiversity and if we grant the exemption for value added products, so that means we may not be able to make use of the biodiversity directly, but this biodiversity joined with another item, not to be seen or not to be separated casually or normally or very comfortably, those value added products may be posing a threat to the structure of the ecosystem, in the name of exploiting the maximum amount of biodiversity, not directly but indirectly. So better we incorporate the value added products into the concept of conservation. And in fact, the frequently asked questions posed to the Ministry of Environment and Forest concerning the biodiversity is referring to a specification stating that the value added products have been removed from the application of the Biodiversity Act only to have some kind of a consensus or a kind of facility that is extended to the commercial community. Is that kind of requirement that is to be undertaken by the Indian state? And in fact, are we in a position to extend such kind of a reservation to the commercial community that their imports and import are not being extended with any kind of a limitation or a regulation as the case may be? We need to check it out once again as to what kind of impact we need to have on the value added products, because that is ultimately referring to biodiversity. Then we need to have accountability of biodiversity management committee. No doubt they have been imposed with an accountability, but are they in a position to have the competency to specify that no, so and so consumption is to be prohibited, so and so biodiversity consumption is to be regularized? Because ultimately it is the central and the state government which has got the power to direct the State Biodiversity Board and the National Biodiversity Board to permit the access to the biodiversity, etc., etc. So when an accountability is created, at the same time, we need to identify the competency is given to some extent through constitution of the technical expert group, no doubt. But to what extent that biodiversity management committee is able to discharge that, to such an extent, some kind of a strengthening of the biodiversity committee is required. Then the protection of BD is required due to be alien species in the sense the foreign items which are entering into the particular ecosystem are able to have their adverse impact on the given ecosystem. So that also should be controlled, wherein the Biodiversity Management Committee is able to identify what are the alien species that are spoiling the various items in the respective ecosystem, and that should be given some kind of a weightage by the central and state governments for the purpose of having a regulation to have the introduction of such alien species into the given ecosystem. The Andhra Pradesh State Biodiversity Board is undertaking some projects which are mentioned herein. They are National Agricultural Innovative Project, Cage Culture, Vaccination and Health Awareness Program, Vermicompost Unit, Construction of Ponds, Introduction of Superior Germplasm, etc., etc. So through these projects, the State Biodiversity Board would like to implement the various schemes that are designed under this particular legislation to achieve the targets in the name of conservation of biodiversity. Ancient Indian approach to environment will make us appreciate our role very perfectly. Rigveda insisted that harmonious coexistence shall be the basic rule for a human being. Then Yajurveda insisted that respect for every item should be practiced by the human being, and he has got the consumption only based on a principle by name Tyaga. That means without giving anything to any item of the nature, he can't make use of the nature. For example, a person who is standing under the shade of a tree to be protected from the sun rays is not having the right to touch the respective tree, either for the purpose of receiving any fruit or a leaf as the case may be. That means only for the purpose of taking the shelter under the tree, that too during the hot summer when he is on the respective way, but not for the purpose of making use of the respective tree for the purpose of receiving any kind of energy other than the shadow. Then we have one more prescription under Yajurveda, that is Nishkama Karma. What does it mean? So the human being is prescribed with a role in the ecosystem as of consumer. So he has to go on act as a consumer only without expecting anything from the nature. He has to go on performing. That means he is prescribed with a duty only but not with a right. Then coming to Manusmriti, Manusmriti insisted that the requirement of the human being with reference to Ardha, that is nothing but wealth, and Kama, which is nothing but desire, and the Moksha, that is nothing but ultimate destination, should be processed only within the principles of Dharma. Dharma means within the permissible limitations, within the restrictions that are imposed on the human being. Then Matsya Purana prescribes ideal for human life, stating that if a person got the construction of 10 wells, it is equivalent to construction of 1 pond. If he got construction of 10 ponds, it is equivalent to 1 lake. If he got construction of 10 lakes, it is equivalent to bringing up a son. And if a person is bringing up 10 sons, then it is equivalent to bringing up of a 1 tree. That means bringing up of 1 tree is equivalent to number of these items which are to be proportionately multiplied, and that much of the service he would be rendering to the environment, wherein his service will be appreciated by the Matsya Purana in such a way that he is able to reach the ultimate destination, which is nothing but moksha. Yajnavalkya Smriti is prescribing a penalty of 20 to 80 panas for cutting a tree. It is prescribing the Ghor Narak for killing an animal for a pleasure. Vishnu Samhita is treating a person as a dead person if he kills the harmless beast. Then Ardhashastra of Kautilya is insisting for the appointment of the spies for the purpose of identifying the culprits concerning the various environmental issues apart from law and order, etc., etc. Then Varaha Purana is requiring the human being to have the plantation with reference to 1 people, 1 neem, 1 bear, 10 flowering plant creepers, 2 pomegranate plants, 2 oranges, 5 mango trees, for the purpose of reserving one's right in the heaven and not to go to hell at any point of time. The various prescriptions under the Vedas, Puranas, etc., etc., have given us a clarity that human being is specified with certain limitations, is specified with certain rules, is specified with certain mandate while he is practicing his lifestyle, and that lifestyle is also institutionalized, and that institutionalized of lifestyle with reference to residential accommodation is in the name of Vastu system. If you observe the Vastu system, it is nothing but the principles of nature have been incorporated in Vastu system. For example, human being is specified with a concern that he needs to have a house constructed with a door opening on the east side. Then what is the scientific reason behind the same? The scientific reason is that early in the morning, sun rays, when it enters into the house, obviously the germs and all will be killed. And once we look into the sun rays, who is considered as the God which is seen by the human senses, obviously the vitamin D that will be received by the human body and the aesthetic sense that will be developed in the human being. So there are so many scientific reasons behind the system of Vastu, which is nothing but institutionalizing the various prescriptions that are given under the various Vedas, Puranas, etc., etc. In the light of the above said knowledge which we need to acquire, even with reference to our constitutional requirement, we need to have the following things adopted in our lifestyle. Thereby, I am sincerely and honestly appealing to all of you to choose the proper person for respective governance at the relevant point of time and have the implementation of the laws in such a way that we will be achieving the targets. And I want all of us to have the restraint over the collection and consumption of the various items in the nature. And I would like to require all of us to have the enlightenment programs conducted from time to time on account of the sufferings which we are having continuously and increasingly. Then we would like to have, and I would like to insist upon, that we need to appreciate the culture scientifically so that we will be developing a tendency in ourselves that we would like to follow the law rather than avoid the law or behave negligently with the law. Then we need to gain the wisdom and practice the knowledge so that all of us will be comfortable and all of us will be facilitating the comfort to the future generations also. I would like to remind you of a story, What a Foodie, for the respective purpose which I would like to highlight at the end of the story. The story is that a person who was able to eat maximum amount of food was undergoing a competition where who will be eating the maximum amount of food within the given point of time. The king has organized a competition for the purpose of declaring a winner that so and so person would be consuming more amount of food within the given point of time. Then in that particular competition, naturally preliminary level will be there, subsequent levels will be there. A person who was famously known for his maximum amount of consumption of the food could not succeed in the final level of the competition. Then the king got surprised, apart from so many other people who are there in that particular courtyard. Then the king questioned him why he could not eat maximum amount of food, because he was known for that particular activity. Then that person who lost the competition specified that the food is from the graveyard. That is the reason with which he could not consume, because once a person knows that the item is from a graveyard which generally will not be liked by the human being, naturally his psychology may not permit him to consume the respective food which is coming from the graveyard. Then king got surprised how this person who is eating the food able to identify that this food is generated in an area wherein the graveyard is located. Then he got called for the respective person who forwarded the particular food items for the purpose of preparing it in the name of food to be used in the competition. Then through that inquiry, ultimately king got a note that the farmer who forwarded this food to the market has had the farmland by the side of the graveyard. And from time to time, because of the lack of the proper governance, he has occupied the graveyard. That means the part of the graveyard has been joined with this cropland, and he has got the cultivation even in the graveyard also. So that means now the king could able to identify, the person who is able to identify the source of the food should only be given a prize rather than a person who is barely consuming the food without identifying the source of the particular item. That means the one who is able to have the comprehensive knowledge and the discharge of the function in a comprehensive manner should only be identified as a person who is the winner of such a competition. Okay, ultimately he was declared a winner, but what is the lesson which we need to identify with reference to our topic, that is biodiversity and the interaction of the human being with the biodiversity? Here two things we have to identify. One is that while identifying a person, we have to choose a person who has got a comprehensive knowledge, comprehensive identification of his function and the sensitivity of the function, etc., etc. That means the people we are now nominating into the various statutory bodies, if they are not sensitive to the functions with which they have been conferred with the power, obviously the result is which we are witnessing in our day-to-day life. And another thing which we need to identify through this particular story is that you might have heard of geographical indication. What is mean by this? For example, a particular area is known for germination or the constitution of a particular item. For example, the Madurai jasmine flower, which is generated on the Madurai land, which is situated in Tamil Nadu state, has got some special feature wherein it has been extended with a geographical indication. That means the land of the Madurai and the composition of that particular land, which is extending the fragrance to the jasmine flower, which is generated in that particular locality, is to be identified with that particular land only. Even if you take that plant outside, that is not having that particular fragrance, because that means the habitat and the item both are having the affection, both are having the interaction, both are having the link with each other. Without one, the other cannot survive. For example, the tribal community, which is having the habitat within the forest area. So previously we have avoided the tribal to reside in the forest area. Through 2006 legislation, we would like to extend the same right the tribal was holding in the name of a statutory right in India, which has been already extended with a human right according to United Nations resolution. If extended, definitely the tribal is able to take care of the forest. So all these dimensions of this particular story should be identified by us and implemented by us, so that ultimately we will be achieving the targets of the legislation with respect of biodiversity at the international level as well as at the national level. The story of the golden egg gives us a slogan that greed breeds sorrow. I would like to remind you the story of golden egg. A farmer was having a duck with him which is giving per day a golden egg. And this fellow used to make use of it, but at a particular point of time, he got a wild idea where he would like to have all the eggs on one day. And accordingly, he has killed the duck, and to his surprise, to his shock, he got only one egg inside the duck's stomach. That means the duck used to generate this duck egg per day per one. But this fellow fails to appreciate the competency of the duck, and he has lost all the eggs forever. Then, what are the points which we need to learn out of this particular story? The first point is that basing on the competency and basing on the nature of the respective item, we need to adopt the respective attitude. And the second point we need to identify through this particular lesson is that we should identify our entitlement also. Without our entitlement, we are not supposed to have the consumption of the natural resources. The story by name The Lesson, which we have heard during our childhood, is holding a lesson for the purpose of identifying the amount of proportionate punishment which we need to impose on a violator. This story is pertaining to a village where a village person was cutting the trees without any reasoning. Then the king called for this person, who made him to wait before the courtyard in the hot summer without any footwear and without any shelter, without any water. This person was made to stand in the sun throughout the day, was feeling thirsty, was feeling tiresome, was feeling some kind of restlessness due to the heavy heat. And by the time he was called inside the kingdom courtyard, he was not able to speak, and he was almost all collapsed. Then king conducted the trial. While he conducted the trial, this person was unable to speak, but for the problem which he had been made to suffer on account of he being called to the courtyard. Then that fellow was asked, "What is that you are feeling?" "I'm feeling thirsty, I'm feeling tiresome, I'm feeling some kind of a temperature." Then king said that, "When you are doing the same kind of affair with that of a tree, is the tree not able to have the same kind of feeling?" Then that fellow could understand, yes, the tree is standing in the sun, and even then it is giving a lot of benefits to many kind items in the nature. When the tree is giving those many number of benefits, how come a human being is able to deprive those benefits coming in the way of the tree, extending the various types of energy to various items of the nature? So this particular story is giving us a lesson that the amount of liability that is to be imposed on a violator should be proportionate to the wrong that he has committed. Long back, Einstein has said something about the environment. To sustain human race, we need to change our attitude absolutely. Tenali Ramakrishna, who was one of the ministers in the Sri Krishna Devaraya kingdom, who is also known as Vikatakavi, and who is also known as the person who has got the utmost wisdom, is being looked at by the rest of the ministers with some jealousy, and they wanted to have some kind of influence played on the king, so that king started avoiding Tenali Ramakrishna. Out of such kind of trials, the courtyard at one point of time facilitated these ministers who were sponsoring the jealousy against Tenali Ramakrishna, and the way in which they dealt with that particular problem is holding some lesson pertaining to the concept of biodiversity. That is the reason with which I have chosen this particular story. And the story is like this. Story in the sense of history is in this particular pattern. On a particular day when the court was working, the people have come into the courtyard with a particular problem, stating that the food grains which they could able to have out of the cultivation when being preserved, they are not able to continue that preservation because rat population eating away the food grains. At that particular point of time, Tenali Ramakrishna was not there in the courtyard, and the other ministers would like to take undue advantage of this situation and have some kind of an influence played over kingdom, so that king started avoiding Tenali Ramakrishna. Whatever the reason may be, the wisdom of these pandits who were not having positive feeling towards the Tenali Ramakrishna can be equated with that of the present modern man. How I will explain. These pandits suggested king that every family should be given a cat, so that that cat will take care of these rats. But to that extent they were in a proper direction only, but subsequently they continued saying that no, simply supplying the cat will not suffice. For the cat, food should be provided, and for serving the cat, milk should be provided. So for milk regularly to have a supply, they need to be provided with a cow, and the cow to be fed by. Accordingly, the crop should be cultivated, land should be given. For cultivation, people should be given to assist this particular family. And then for maintaining this family and cultivation, take care of seeds, fertilizers, etc., they need to be given some amount. So like that, a big list has been prepared by these pandits to be extended to each and every family, right from cat, then cow, then cropland, then the money, the seeds, fertilizers, etc., etc. So ultimately, it's a heavy burden on the treasury. Anyhow, king wanted to make these pandits imposed with some kind of an obligation where they should understand the real wisdom of the Ramakrishna. So accordingly, king said that, okay, let it be. So all those things were extended to each and every family, but all these people were continued to have the suffering of the rat population, which is eating away the grains. Then the Tenali Ramakrishna could able to sort out this particular problem, particularly in his house, by providing the hot milk to the cat which is depending upon the consumption of the milk only, but not targeting the rat population, which is the natural prey for the cat, which is the natural food for the cat. Okay, he could able to sort out that particular problem and he was comfortable. But again, after some period of time, the people came to the courtyard stating that, Maharaja, the problem is as it is. We are not able to sort out the problem. Do something for us. Please protect us. Please take care of us. Then he asked Tenali Ramakrishna, Tenali Ramakrishna, what is the solution for this particular problem? Then he explained that the nature has prescribed the various rules and regulations in such a way that it has facilitated the structure of the nature in such a way that one item can be a food for the another item. So depending upon this item, that item will be continuing its existence. And this is the way in which the population of the each and every item in the nature is being regulated upon. And he said that allow the nature to work. It automatically works for you. No need of any interference with any of the item in the nature. And the Ramakrishna statement has been upheld by the Sri Krishna Devaraya, and accordingly he has taken back these cats, cow, cultivable land, etc., relieving the burden on the treasury, and allowed these rat population to be eaten away by the cat population, which is normally be maintained by the nature. Since we have identified the significance of the biodiversity, let us take the pledge for life, recognizing that the variety of life on earth underpins the very survival of me, my fellow citizens around the world, realizing the need to behave responsibly to protect our biological diversity, responding to the increasing loss of our plants, animals, and other life forms on this planet Earth, accepting my responsibility to promote better management and use of the biological diversity around me. I pledge my support to the following principles for better life on Earth. I will promote conservation and sustainable management of biological resources. Be the change I want to see. Ensure life on Earth is secure and safe. Educate people on the benefits of conservation, use, and benefit sharing actions.
Perhaps it might be nicer to think of others before you use up all the water. Energy-saving bulbs use 1/5 of the energy of ordinary bulbs. Is your heating turned up too high? If animals can recycle, so can we. We could all bring our own bags when we go shopping.
Darn, I'm handsome, but I won't have my good looks for long. I'm sure you have some great advice to keep me looking hot as spice. Sorry, I'm really sick. Sick of people that make me look like this. So do something now. Use me to express your concern and spread the word. Thank you.